Hello! Today, I'm going to break down a rather complex kind of argument for God's existence. It's going to build on top of this standard ontological argument, which I'm going to assume you're familiar with. We're not really going to be looking at the second premise here, because Gödelian ontological arguments basically amount to an intriguing defense of the first premise. But if you don't clearly explain the concepts in this kind of argument, it ends up looking like magic. So let's clearly explain the concepts in this argument. To understand this argument, you need to have a grasp of what vacuous truth is, and also what entailment is. Let's start by looking at vacuous truth. Here's a statement. All my sisters are married. Is this true or false? Well, the thing is, I don't have any sisters. So it seems weird to say that it's true because I don't have any married sisters. But it also seems weird to say that it's false because I don't have any unmarried sisters either. However, to get an answer, we can interpret this statement in first-order logic. First-order logic is the formal language used in mathematics and proofs. If we interpret our statement in this language, it can be shown that the statement, all my sisters are married, is logically equivalent to nobody is both my sister and also unmarried. They're either both true or they're both false. This makes some intuitive sense. But that second statement is obviously true. No one is both my sister and also unmarried because no one is my sister. And since that one is true, the other one is true as well. So, all my sisters are married is true. Again, that sounds odd, but it's the best way of interpreting the statement in the language of first-order logic. The important takeaway here is that when we're constructing a logical proof, statements like, all five-sided squares are purple, or everyone living on Pluto is happy, are going to count as true statements automatically. Now that we have a grasp of vacuous truth, let's look at entailment. This is pretty simple. X entails Y means that in every possible world where X is true, Y is also true. Here's a possible world where X is true, so Y is true in it. Here's another. If X is false in a possible world, then Y could be true or false, that doesn't matter. All that matters is that when X is true, Y is true too. Here's a concrete example. Ice exists, entails, water exists. Every possible world wherein ice exists, water also exists. This is true even though there might be possible worlds where water exists, but there is nonetheless no ice. Maybe it's all boiling in that possible world. Using the same maneuver as earlier, this can be shown to be logically equivalent to the fact that there is no possible world that contains both the propositions ice exists and no water exists. There isn't any possible world like that. Now, here's a super important note. Entailment doesn't mean that there has to be any sort of logical connection between these two propositions. For example, ice exists entails 2 plus 2 equals 4. Why? Well, 2 plus 2 equals 4 in all possible worlds. So every possible world that contains ice exists also contains 2 plus 2 equals 4 automatically. Again, that could be rephrased as saying that there is no possible world where ice exists and 2 plus 2 isn't 4. Now, here's where we're going with all this entailment and vacuous truth stuff. Let's look at this statement. 2 plus 2 isn't 4, entails ice exists. Is this true or false? Well, that first part, 2 plus 2 isn't 4, is true in no possible world. It is necessarily false. But X entails Y when all worlds that contain X also contain Y. Since there are no possible worlds that contain X, namely 2 plus 2 isn't 4, then this statement is vacuously true. It's actually a true statement that 2 plus 2 isn't 4 entails ice exists because there is no possible world where 2 plus 2 isn't 4 and ice does not exist. There isn't any possible world like that. So drill that into your head. Impossible things entail everything. If you understand that impossible things entail everything, then the rest of this argument is much easier to follow. Basically, Godelian arguments will look at positive properties, or the property of perfection, or something like that. These are basically just a stand-in for God's properties, omniscience, omnipotence, necessary existence, and so on. Then the argument makes some claim about what the entailments of this property are. What exactly that claim will be varies from argument to argument, but one that I like is that perfection doesn't entail imperfection. Put another way, the proposition that a perfect being exists doesn't entail an imperfect being exists. Coolio. Now this principle directly guarantees the existence of God. And that's what looks like magic, but if you understand that impossible things entail everything, the logic is straightforward. We can make a diagram to illustrate the reasoning. To begin, either the property of perfection is possible or impossible. That is, either there is a perfect being in at least one possible world, or no possible world. If there is a perfect being in at least one possible world, then it exists in every possible world, and therefore God exists. Standard ontological argument stuff. If you want to instead say that perfection is impossible, then no possible world has a perfect being in it. But then we can make a statement like, all possible worlds that have a perfect being in them have an imperfect being in them. And this is going to be vacuously true. The all worlds there is really referring to zero worlds if perfection is impossible. If there is no possible world that contains a perfect being, then there isn't any possible world that both contains a perfect being and also lacks an imperfect being. That means that the existence of a perfect being would entail the existence of an imperfect being, given our definition of entailment. Perfection entails imperfection. That's why the premise of a Godelian argument is something like, perfection doesn't entail imperfection. Because accepting that premise means you need to deny that perfection entails imperfection, which means that you need to deny that all worlds with a perfect being have an imperfect being, which means you need to deny that no world has a perfect being in it, which means you need to deny that perfection is impossible, which means you need to affirm that perfection is possible, which means you need to affirm that God exists in some possible world, which means you need to affirm that God exists in all possible worlds, which means you need to affirm that God exists. Phew, that was a lot. To sum up, impossible things entail everything. So if there's something, anything, like imperfection, which is not entailed by God's properties, then God's existence is possible, and therefore God exists. Hopefully, I explained that clearly enough. Anyways, that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and support me on Patreon if you enjoy this content.